Okay, my name is Cara Baldari, and I am the Vice President of Family Economics at First Focus, which is a bipartisan kids advocacy group doing mostly federal policy, located here in the district. And I'm going to kind of be, giving a little bit of an overview of some of the work we've been doing around reducing child poverty on the federal level, including, how we've been utilizing the study in our work. And then Christine will kind of go into a little more detail about the findings of the study. So I know none of this is news to the people in the room, but just to kind of set a little bit of context and starting out, we know that child poverty remains really high in the United States. Despite some kind of recent good news from the economy, we know that those gains are not reaching families at the bottom. And children continue to disproportionately experience poverty and experience poverty at rates that are 62% higher than adults. And children of color, we have large disparities, continue to experience poverty at rates 3 times that of white children. And, we have a lot of children also living in deep poverty. So that means, a family of 4 living at about, below $12,000 a year. And, we know that we know all the negative outcomes for children who are living in poverty, and we're going to kind of be talking a little about those more. Something to note, this is the official poverty measure, right? So 17% of children are living in poverty, kind of using the official measure. We also, and we're going to be talking a little bit about using the supplemental poverty measure, which kind of takes into account cost of living as well as impact of benefits for families. So that number is a little lower, right? We know that anti-poverty programs have a big impact in reducing child poverty, things like SNAP, and tax credits, but that still remains high. So using that measure, about 15% of children are living in poverty. And using an adjusted measure, which is what the study uses, which we're going to mention, which kind of takes into account underreporting of benefits, it's still 13% of children living in poverty. So no matter what measure you're using, there's a lot of children living in poverty. And we know that children are living in poverty in all kind of geographic reasons, but it tends to be, children who are, high rates of poverty tend to be kind of concentrated around the country. States did see decreases in the past census data in 2017, but a lot of the states that saw decreases were the states with the highest rates of poverty to begin with, so poverty still remains high in those places. Something to note again, these are the official poverty measure. This map would look very different if you were using the supplemental, because again, it takes into account high cost of living, so places like California, Hawaii, actually, using that have some of the highest levels of child poverty around the country. So as Congresswoman Barbara Lee mentioned, right, we have this landmark study that just came out in late February from the National Academies of Sciences. And for a little bit of context, so First Focus had worked directly with Congresswoman Lee and Congresswoman Roybal Allard's offices on this study. We felt like we know that, as the Congresswoman mentioned, we know what we need to do to reduce child poverty, but we don't have the political will, we don't have enough awareness around it. So we felt like a study like this, coming from the National Academies, which is known and has a reputation for evidence-based analysis, is seen as nonpartisan, would have a really big effect on the Hill, because it's still really respected from both sides of the aisle. And these studies get a lot of attention. The study has been getting a lot of media attention, which we're really excited to see. So we felt like, although we know there's a lot of great studies out there on child poverty, this study was still needed and would hold a lot of credibility for some time for lawmakers. So we had worked directly with those offices to get funding in both the 2016 and 2017 appropriations bills around it, and then some private foundations also contributed some money. So Christine's going to go into further detail around the findings, but I just kind of wanted to share some of the top findings and our kind of top takeaways to set a little bit of context. And so, we think one of the biggest things coming out of this study is it says that child poverty is solvable. So, they lay out a set of policy and program packages that could cut our child poverty rate in half within a decade. So there's no excuse. It's doable, right? And we think that's a really big takeaway because it's often really seen as a very intractable problem, right, from the media and others. And it backs up that we could do it with these policy and program packages, but it also shows that other countries are doing it. It highlights that Canada is currently already cut their rate in half by a third within a few years due to increasing their child benefit, or known as a child allowance, which I know Luke is going to talk about more. And they also set a target to do it, right? So they said, we're going to commit to this, we're going to do something. The UK also had set a target and made significant progress within a decade as well. So they kind of highlight, right, that other places have done it, so we could do it too. And they also confirm that there's a direct causal link between poverty and negative child outcomes, right? So it's the poverty itself that's causing, and therefore increasing resources and boosting family income then, right, could cause positive outcomes both in the short and long term. So that's really helpful. It also makes clear that reducing child poverty makes smart economic sense. As the Congresswoman mentioned, the study finds that child poverty costs our country about $1 trillion a year, and even the most expensive kind of policy package that they put forward would cost about $110 billion a year. So we know big savings, right, to cut our rate in half, even from the most kind of expensive policy package. And then another big takeaway that we thought might be helpful is, it says that work requirements don't work. So it says that, the study finds insufficient evidence that mandatory work policies reduce child poverty and actually are just as likely to increase child poverty as they are to decrease it. So we find that really helpful, right, in our work and the work I'm sure many of you are doing, around kind of pushing back against work requirements, to Medicaid, SNAP, and kind of other threats we've seen from the administration as well as from governors around the country. The study also lays out that we've made progress in the past, and as you could see from this is again using a supplemental measure. That progress has really slowed in the past decade, and that we kind of correlate with a decrease in the share of spending on kids. So First Focus every year puts out a children's budget book that analyzes spending across federal programs for children. And we have shown that the share of federal spending on kids continues to decline. So kids make up about 1/4 of our population and only make up about 8% of our federal budget, and that number continues to decline. So we know that money matters to reducing child poverty. We need investments, and we haven't been making those, and so we've really seen kind of a stagnation in any progress. So again, just to kind of provide you a broad overview, the study finds that no one particular policy can cut our child poverty rate in half within 10 years. So again, it puts together these policy and program packages that when combining policies could have that effect. It models 4 packages and then finds 2 of those could actually have the impact of cutting the rate in half. And those packages include things like increasing SNAP benefits, increasing and making improvements to tax credits, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child and Dependent Care Tax Credit, and kind of converting the child tax credit to what we call a child benefit, child allowance, a monthly, amount that would go to every kid. And again, I know we're going to hear more about that. Increasing the supply of housing vouchers, so making vouchers available for about 70% of the families that are eligible for them, as well as increasing the minimum wage. The study models it to $10.25 an hour based on the evidence that they felt comfortable using, but we know there's also legislation out there to increase it to $15, and there's a lot of efforts in states and cities. One thing to note, while they found that no one particular policy could cut our rate in half within a decade, they found that an annual $3,000 child allowance, about $250 a month per kid, would have the biggest impact of any policy, but also would cut our deep child poverty rate in half within a decade. So that on its own would cut deep child poverty, which we know is really important. And just to give you, this is a little bit of a wonky chart. We're working on some better ones, but this just kind of visualizes, right? So that child allowance too, that's the $3,000 or I think $2,700 a year child allowance would have the biggest impact in reducing child poverty, and housing vouchers are number 2. So just to kind of show you some of the policies that would have the biggest impacts. So we have this great study that says, right, we can cut child poverty in half. So now we want to act to do that, right? We want to take this and use it. So First Focus runs what we call the U.S. Child Poverty Action Group, which is a partnership of national organizations, right, who are focused on kids and working to reduce child poverty on the national level. Child Welfare League of America is one of the members. And so we had felt like we knew the study was coming, and so it's time for a campaign to say, you know, we have this evidence base, we can cut child poverty in half, now we need a target. And again, this target's not a new idea. Other countries have set targets, and in fact, around the country, there's states that are setting targets. So California, Wisconsin, Maine, some cities, there's these campaigns to end child poverty, as well as, to kind of set this target, commit, put forward policies. So we were like, we need to build on that momentum and do something at the national level. So we're calling this campaign End Child Poverty US. And we have a series of resources on our website that, we're trying to be a resource hub for folks doing this work around the country, right? Webinars, fact sheets, things that you could use in your work to say this is doable, summarizing the study findings. We have a summary, we have our top takeaways, we're gonna have some deeper policy analysis coming. What are ways you could use all this to kind of build momentum in your state, or city, or that you could contribute, right, and say to your federal delegation, let's do something about this. One of the kind of main pieces of legislation we're pushing, which is not reintroduced yet, but we're hoping soon, is the Child Poverty Reduction Act, which would set a national target to cut our rate in half in 10 years, eliminate within 20 years, and then kind of monitor progress, right? So there would be an entity that would file reports and kind of show how we're doing and create a level of accountability, right? To say, the government committed to doing this, how are we doing? We need tools to really push forward. So, and Congresswoman Barbara Lee is one of the leads on that in the House, which we're really grateful for, and there's legislation in both the House and Senate. So if you want to hear updates about that legislation, receive our materials, kind of see what we're doing, participate, we would love that. And so our website is End Child Poverty US. We have like kind of a place, right, where you could sign up to receive our updates and be on our listserv. We also are very active on Twitter at CPAC_USA. And you can always feel free to reach out to me as well with any questions, and would love to collaborate. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Chris James Brown. I'm the CEO of the Child Welfare League of America, and I was a member of the committee that produced the report. And I want to do a time check because I know I just came from my own conference, so I know how it is to keep things on time. So, 10 minutes? 15? Okay. So you'll hold me to that. So normally, those of us on the committee have gone around the country and are presenting the slides I'm going to show in a minute. But we haven't had the advantage in other settings of having the Congresswoman provide some input and having First Focus provide some input. So if you'll bear with me, I think I'm going to try to reframe the slides in the form of the so what almost, okay? And why does it matter for you? So first I have to figure out, just the way? Yes. So I want to tell you some things about the committee that I think are important and will provide some context for any questions that you have. First of all, the committee operated under two different administrations. It was established but was maintained under the Trump administration. So it gives it a more bipartisan kind of cast. In addition to that, it had support from both sides of the aisle. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out. The second is that the committee operated with some constraints that were major for me and less major for others. So I come from an organization that focuses on policy and advocacy. I'm a practitioner at heart, and I think long-term. We were charged as a committee to come up with recommendations for reducing poverty that could be done within the context of 10 years. So when you got into issues of intergenerational poverty, the importance of education and childcare, we couldn't really talk about those things. We really had to stay focused on things that were doable in that 10-year time frame, which you can imagine was extraordinarily challenging for me in particular. The committee was composed of 14 academics and 2 others, myself and 1 other person who was an administrator / practitioner. The next thing I want you to know about the committee is that we were really constrained to use evidence. There were lots of things we wanted to talk about, particularly in the area of housing, and we were limited in recommendations that we could provide the high-quality blue ribbon evidence around. I'm very, very, very committed to the importance of evidence, but there were a lot of things we wanted to understand and look at deeper, but we could not because of the constraint of it having to be evidence-based, everything that we recommended. And then the supplemental poverty measure which was used was the other thing that we were required to use. That was not optional, we were required to use that. Now it's a good thing because it factors in things like housing costs and others, but we were really told that we had to use that. So you already heard from everyone that this report was done within the framework of people being concerned about the level of poverty in this country and the fact that we were not making the same progress that others were making. It was also within the context of people not being sure if there was really a causal impact on child well-being by their being in poverty. People kind of knew there was a correlation between poverty and some other things, but was there a causal impact? You heard it already. The study put that question to rest and really was able to demonstrate using evidence that there's a direct causal relationship between a child being in poverty and their well-being. And the longer they were in poverty and the younger they started in poverty, the worse it was. So that was a very important thing. Specific to housing, we knew we had to look at housing as an issue because we also knew that the quality of housing and the availability of housing for people was a key factor in child well-being. I came into it knowing it from my experience in child welfare and the fact that so many children coming into child welfare were impacted by the fact that their parents didn't have stabilized housing. But we also as a committee recognized that. So housing was something that we thought about from the very beginning. So I'm going to kind of fly through a lot of these. You see that this was a statement of task for the committee. We really had to look at what's the connection between poverty and well-being. We really needed to find objective ways to analyze the impact of major programs on reducing poverty. And we were fortunate with some of the programs because there's not a lot of research in this country done, unfortunately, on the connection between various programs and poverty and child well-being. But there were some programs like Earned Income Tax Credit where you had built in the fact that the country had expanded or contracted the program. So you had right there in front of you the opportunity to look at it in a scientific way. And we had to provide policy recommendations for reducing poverty by half in 10 years, which I told you was a real challenge for me. Is this moving? Yes. I already talked about the causal impacts of poverty. We were able to demonstrate that it does. And we were able to also demonstrate that the programs there, like SNAP, Earned Income Tax Credit program, really did make a difference and really did help reduce the impact that poverty had and the level of poverty. If you look at these various programs, you see that without the existing programs, poverty would be higher in this country. So when you start to hear things about, sometimes we think in a very disconnected way in this country, and we need to think in a more holistic way. So when you hear a rumor that maybe we're going to reduce the Earned Income Tax Credit program or we're going to do SNAP, it's not just a matter of reducing those individual programs, it's the implications it has for the poverty level and the well-being of our children in this country. There's some conversation about changing the poverty index. Have you heard that? That could have a dramatic impact on the number of people eligible for the programs that we know are going to help child well-being. There's conversation about the Census Bureau and reducing the extent to which people are willing to report. That's going to have a major impact. So just as the theme of your conference is thinking kind of across and sectors, we have to be thinking across the various things that are occurring in this country and understanding the impact that they ultimately have on children and families. So you look at all the housing subsidy program, you see that it has an impact. Not as great as the others, but it does have an impact in terms of reducing poverty. So we had to look at individual policy recommendations and options, and our initial thought was, we'll figure out one or two and recommend them, and they'll make all the difference and reduce the level of poverty in this country. It did not work out that way. We really had to start to connect different things, some of the work-related programs, some of the universal programs, and really put them together in a way that the package as a whole was what ended up. These were the criteria that we use for am I going too fast? It's okay. These are the criteria that we use for identifying which programs and which policies we wanted to look at. Of course, we had to look at how much research is around those programs, to what extent will it reduce poverty. Particularly in high-risk groups, we identified early that certain groups were at higher risk of poverty than others, and we wanted to make sure we didn't come up with a plan that would have an impact across the board, but not drill down to the Native American population, African American population, or people in deep poverty. We had to keep that in mind too. So we needed to look at the differential impact, the cost, of course, and we had to look at what was the impact on work, marriage opportunity, and social inclusion. We couldn't come up with programs that didn't also acknowledge that these were other factors that relate to child well-being. These are the different programs, and you'll see they're in 4 different categories. The easy category is looking at provision of services to the immigrant population, where so many are excluded from certain benefits. So that was one. That's the second one on the left. Then policies from other countries. It was mentioned we looked carefully at the child tax credit program both in England and in Canada. And then we looked at programs that kind of modified the existing safety net programs, the ones you're familiar with, SNAP and Housing Choice Voucher and expanding SSI. And then we looked at some of the programs that were tied to work, because there was a real debate on the other thing I forgot to mention at the committee was conservatives, liberals, all over the place. So work and marriage was super important to some people, whereas other things were important to others. So we had to factor in what's the impact as it relates to work. So we looked at the fact that no single program would do what we hoped. There was no magic bullet, no silver bullet in all of this, and that enhancements to SNAP, the housing voucher, and child allowance came closest, and that enhancements to EITC and also reduced poverty significantly. So this is probably one you really can't see. We looked at the extent to which the programs had an impact on poverty reduction. If you look all the way down, it looks then at the cost, and this was mentioned earlier. The bottom line when you think about the cost is that it's much more expensive to leave children in poverty. And I'm talking about the expense to our country, some of the hidden expenses, much less the expense to just having children suffer within poverty. Keep going real fast. Keep. So that's the range in cost for the packages as compared to how much it costs. And you heard this already, so I won't dwell on this. So it's much less expensive to invest. But when we talked about this in various settings, the cost of it has been one of the major issues that's been raised. Even though you try to say, well, it's going to save us money in the long run. The cost issue, which gets back to the issue of priorities in this country and being able to think long-term versus short-term. So you just can't tinker with just a housing program. And I know in this group, because you're thinking in an integrated way, you know that it can't just be housing. You have to look at a number of things in order. You have to bundle things, and you have to bundle some of the work-related, because everybody wants to work at the end of the day, but not everybody can work. So we have to put together packages that recognize both things. I want to talk about the contextual factors, because I feel most pleased with this section, which is the least developed section of the report. This is the long-term advocate people on the committee saying we can't leave it with just making these recommendations without having people understand the contextual nature of poverty. The fact that stability and predictability of income, for example, is so important. the fact that, you know, the kind of housing that people live in, the fact that they are people of color and experiencing discrimination and all. You can't say, well, we're going to implement all of these programs without acknowledging that there's some contextual factors that will drive the way these programs are implemented. And you all in this room know that probably better than most, that all these contextual factors are interconnected. You know, so positive neighborhood conditions and health and well-being, as an example. And that gets back to, as we think about what's happening in our country and the different attempts to make change, if we're not going to have good water in a part of the country, we're not going to have good health and well-being, we're not going to have good neighborhoods, and then the schools are going to suffer, right? So all of this is interconnected in so many ways. So these are the challenges I just want to put up quickly, and I'll make sure you get these slides. There are challenges as it relates to stability and predictability of income. Some of our recommendations said we need to make sure that funds are given out monthly rather than annually, so that we can deal with the lack of predictability. Oops. Challenges around access to programs. I mean, one of the things that was most surprising to me was the number of deserts that we talk about in our literature. So there's the food desert, there's the medical desert, there's the housing affordability desert, and they all kind of are in about the same places. They overlap in location. So how do we make sure that we reach those people? And then how about disabled people? We talked a lot on the committee about disabled people who couldn't get to different programs and services, so the need to look at that piece quickly. And then there's some promising practices that we identified related to each. You know that the racial and ethnic issues cut across everything. They cut across housing, they cut across access, they cut across all of the other contextual factors, and we need to acknowledge that. Housing discrimination as it relates to the criminal justice system issues that we identify, where people come out of jail and aren't able to go into public housing in many situations. So the treatment by the criminal justice system, the need to keep that all in our heads at the same time. Neighborhood conditions, you all work with that quite a bit. Health and well-being. The impact of health and the connection to poverty in this country was overwhelming to me in terms of what I learned from working on that chapter. The chronic illness in this country is on the rise. And it's not at all connected to understanding that many of the people who have chronic illnesses are in neighborhoods where there's no access to health care. So you're starting to see how unraveled things are for people who are low income. But there are promising practices around health and well-being. So I just wanted to spend a few more minutes on the recommendations related to housing. You know that there are a lot of different housing programs, right? And we wanted to address all of them, and we could really only address, we knew that housing is essential to move people forward, stabilize people, make sure that they can get a job and keep a job. You know, housing is at the core of all of this. Housing costs are a key part of how we calculate the supplemental poverty measure. It's increasingly unaffordable, as you all know. People are getting evicted, and that just leads them into deeper poverty. Only 1/4 of eligible households are receiving the housing programs that they are eligible for. And we propose an expansion of the housing voucher program to reach more eligible families with children. Now, we didn't make any other recommendations related to housing for, I think, the next one. So let me just talk about it. We're proposing 2 options for each of our policy proposals. And the difference between the 2 options is the number of people that would be impacted, and therefore the cost. So you'll see that in option, and then how they impact deep poverty. So those are that's what that shows. Are you all familiar with the TRIM model? So the TRIM model that we use throughout is an analytical model that can take the connection between making certain investments in policy programs and the outcomes. And it factors in take-up rates and all kinds of things that I don't even want to think about, but it factors in all the things that will get you to an understanding of the impact that a tweak in the program will have in terms of the poverty rate. Okay? So that one, I'm sorry, that one covered 70%, and the other one covered 50%. Okay? So I do want to say that there were some drawbacks to the fact that we use a supplemental poverty measure. It's just because of how subsidized housing gets calculated in that formula. So the drawbacks were not significant enough that we wanted to toss it out. But I did want to mention that they're all drawbacks. You can read some more in it in the report. There were a lot of suggestions. I don't know, did any of you make recommendations to the committee? We had an overwhelming number of recommendations from people in the housing world for what to do. And we looked at all of the recommendations. 1 minute, okay. So, and we had to make a decision based on what research we had available to us as to whether to do it. So, the reason we went with the housing voucher program is because public housing is on the decline. We didn't want to invest in public housing. We thought investing in the voucher program was the best to give people the opportunity to go into the private housing market. And then we knew that there would be a need to work with developers on the supply side if we went in another direction, and we knew that that would take too long to have real impact on the 10-year time frame. And then there wasn't a lot of data that we could use to track the impact of that. Now I have about half a second. So I want to encourage you to use this tool. You can use it by neighborhood, you can use it by zip code to really understand poverty in your neighborhood and how the different programs get played out, given how you increase or decrease them. So you can get that, and then this is where you can get the whole report. Make it? Okay.
Good morning. So I am here and I get to talk to you about my very favorite subject, child allowance. I am a faculty member at the University of Michigan, and I run a new university-wide initiative called Poverty Solutions. Our charge from President Schlissel is to partner with communities and policymakers to find new ways to prevent and alleviate poverty in Michigan, the nation, and the world. So we're just trying to bite off a little thing. And we really try to take seriously and echo the premise of the remarks by Congresswoman Lee this morning, that we want to try to do transformational things. We want to allow ourselves to envision what would it really look like in a decade if we made a transformational impact in reducing child poverty. What would that look like? And what would we have to do as soon as we could envision that? What do we have to work back to make that a reality? So in my own work, much of my research has been about child poverty in the United States. I wrote a book with Kathy Eden called $2 a Day, where I went from being primarily a policy wonk, data nerd type of guy, and I'm still that. I love spreadsheets. They make me feel warm inside. But in $2 a Day, I got to go all over the country and meet families whose only income coming into the household was what they made from selling their blood plasma. And I got to find out about what the exchange rate for selling your food stamps was, because people couldn't pay their rent or the utility bills. 50 cents on the dollar, 60 cents on the dollar. Down in the Mississippi Delta, 30 cents on the dollar, because there's so many people with extreme low levels of cash income. I got to see what family homelessness looks like in America, where you have families and shelters and on the street, but probably even more so doubled up with families and friends in precarious settings. And we've been working with a student of mine in the administrative data in the state in Michigan, looking at child homelessness as recorded by the public schools, kids that are in shelters, on the street, or precariously doubled up with families and friends. And we find that 1 in 10 kids in Michigan experience a spell of homelessness during their school years. So this isn't something that just affects one small population. It's a dynamic experience, and a lot of our kids are going through it. And lately, I've been doing a lot more work not looking at families at the very, very bottom, but looking at the scope of hardship among children. And any measure that you take, trouble, falling behind on your rent, falling behind on your utilities, being in a household where somebody didn't go to the doctor because they couldn't afford it. Children have the highest rates of hardship of any group out there. In fact, when you compare children to seniors, children are in households that experience 2 to 4 times the rates of hardship of seniors. So what do we do? How do we do something transformational? Well, I've been thinking a lot about a couple of tenets for that. And the first starts with an old acronym, keep it simple, stupid, KISS. And don't tell my other policy wonk friends, but I kind of think when we really, all else being equal, when we start to complicate our policies, right? When we put more sort of phasing schedules and notches, right? When we have more hoops that people have to jump through in order to get those. Every time we complicate our policy in some way, I sort of imagine some family falling off, right? Falling out of the program. And so I think there's some complicated policies that work, but usually the simpler, the better. And that's a way that we can make it easy for families to understand. We can make it easy for us to understand, you all who are out there working, right? Trying to keep things simple is important. A second tenet that I've been thinking a lot about is that cash is king. This is, I think, a change, and this conversation has really moved, I would say, over the last 5 to 10 years that we started to understand sometimes helping families, the best possible thing we can do is just show them the money. Turns out, often families know more about what they need in any given circumstance than anyone else. And so when we restrict the type of aid that we provide, right, not only does that sort of complicate it, but it also means maybe we don't get the biggest bang for our buck, right? I would often think as I was watching a family sell their SNAP because they couldn't pay their utilities, which, by the way, is a felony, right? And if you look at the application, most SNAP applications, you'll see, that it says if you get caught trafficking your SNAP, you could face a $250,000 fine and up to 20 years in prison. So actually, by the way, you're better off robbing a bank by the letter of the law than selling your food stamps. Now, I don't think we've ever penalized anyone up to that level, but that's what we make people sign when they come to get aid, right? As I'd follow families and they'd spend, 50 cents, go to a grocery store that they knew do it, and slide through their card for fake groceries of $100 in groceries and get 50 cents back, I would think, we would have gotten such a better value, right? Taxpayers would have gotten such a better value if we just given them the $100 in cash, right? Because that flexibility, because they have other needs, and sometimes food is the easiest thing to get, right? That flexibility mattered to them so much that they were not only willing to break the law, but give up 50% of the purchasing power. I think housing is an example of this, right? I'm all for housing policy, but in Detroit, one of our biggest housing crises, this is a place where I'm doing a lot of work. I have a number of staff members embedded at City Hall in Detroit on a partnership on economic mobility. And one of the biggest housing crises in Detroit is tax foreclosure, right? Where we've seen 1/4 of all homes in the city given up to tax foreclosure. That puts pressure on the rental market. And that means you have a lot more instability. And we're not gonna keep people in the homes that they own with a lot of the housing policies that we spend time, but cash can. Another tenet is that dignity matters. So as I got to know families, especially parents of the families that we got to know in $2 a day, we were quite certain that the moms especially, or the dads, would go hungry for a day or two if they could be treated with respect. And being poor, being at the very bottom in this country is often sort of a repeated experience of social isolation and rejection. And we do a lot to them in the way that we implement some of our programs, by making them sign food stamp applications that criminalizes rational behavior, right, and trafficking their food stamps. And so the more, I think cash matters. I think cash matters a lot. But the way we deliver it, I think, also matters. And we're starting to see a lot of studies that provide cash to families, and they talk about it differently. They might say, this is something that we're offering you because we know you want to do right by your children. And this is some money to help you do that. And we get different results when we say that versus, this is some money we're giving to you because you're poor and you can't take care of your children without it. Okay, so where does that get us? So as is often the case, looking around the world, you can see some models. There's been a number of times in my history where like, what we should really do is provide a child benefit monthly, right? That wouldn't change with income and treat everybody the same. And it turns out like most other rich countries are already doing this. So a child allowance is just that. It says raising kids is expensive. And in society, we have a vested interest in making sure that parents have the resources they need to do that well. It's universal or near universal, so it treats everyone the same. This is what I really love about it. It turns out I'm a college professor. I have a pretty decent salary, and raising kids I think is still expensive. Right? This is a policy that it can appeal to me and to families at the very bottom. It pays out monthly or quarterly, right? So that we know, as we're hearing, we can deal with some of that instability as we're seeing families' incomes that swing, way up and way down over the course of the year. And in the NAS report and in a paper that a number of my colleagues and I wrote a couple of years ago, the typical child allowance that we're talking about is something along the orders of $250 per child per month. 2 families, right? And we say, this is something to help you do right by your children. Canada was so happy with the child benefit that they instituted a number of years ago that they just increased it. They're not just doing $3,000 a year, like this $250 child allowance I was talking about. It goes up to $6,000 a year. My new motto is, we can at least be half as good as Canada. David Brooks had a wonderful column a few weeks ago where he said, whoa, look, Canada had this huge poverty reduction. What did they do? I investigated, and it was grassroots, community level, people getting together and streamlining their services, really working together. And I am all for that stuff, grassroots action. But the reason Canada had such big poverty reduction is the largest in the world child allowance, child benefit. Because it's simple. It's something we can get to everyone. All right. Another thing that I imagine a lot of you think about is the issue of marginal tax rates, right? Where you might be working with families to get them working. Most of the families we got to know, and I imagine a lot of the families that you work with want to work, and they see work as an option out of poverty. But one of the many barriers to that, right, are these drop-offs in benefits as they go up the chain, right, where their food stamps goes down. If they're in housing, right, their housing voucher declines. And sometimes that can mean that they're no better off. And it turns out working is expensive, right? When you work, got to do something with childcare. You got to get to work. And you got to get your work clothes, right? So the child allowance, again, is simple. It takes care of all of that by saying everybody gets the same amount. So the NAS report, I think, is a landmark report that documents many things with an incredible group of panelists, and I really commend them for the work that they did. I looked at all of these different options on how to reduce child poverty by 50%. One option was to increase the earned income tax credit by 40%. That would impact child poverty, it would reduce child poverty by 16.5%. All right, It's not bad. It's not 50%. Could raise the minimum wage to $10.25 an hour and index it to inflation. Certainly been a lot of talk about the minimum wage. And I'm imagining the economists in the room were part of the reason why it was set at $10.25 and not $15 an hour. But hey, some of my best friends are economists. But raising the minimum wage to $10.25 an hour, that would reduce child poverty by 1.6%. I think both of these things tell us that as much as we care about work, right, as much as work is important, as much as I think the families who we work with see work as a path out of poverty, we're not going to get to 50% child poverty reduction through work-based programs. Housing voucher, let's get up to 70% of eligible folks. That does a little bit better, 24% poverty reduction. And expansion of SNAP, 30% higher, boosted up in summer. All great ideas, 18% poverty reduction. A $250 child allowance paid monthly to all families. In the report, they phase it out at like 300 to 400% of poverty, so well above the poverty line. That reduces poverty by 40%, and deep poverty by 50%. And it effectively eliminates the kind of poverty that Kathy, Eden, and I were motivated by to write the book, $2 a Day. So this is transformational change, right? This is something that we would be able to see. Sometimes I think studies say, look at the poverty reductions here, and you really have to go to the peer-reviewed article to be able to say, oh, okay, there were poverty reductions, I guess, because we can't see it on the ground. But if we did this, I think all the evidence suggests we would see it. So I recently went up for promotion to full professor, which doesn't matter to anyone except those of us in the academy. And when you do that in the academy, you have to sort of go out for letters where they sort of ask other scholars to review your work and say, are you any good? And so I had written this paper on child allowances a couple years ago, and that was part of my packet. And this one reviewer came back, and you don't know who they are, it's all anonymous, said, well, I guess it's okay for Professor Schaefer to be writing about things like the child allowance, even though it never has any possibility of becoming a reality in this country. I guess it's good to have people sort of writing aspirationally. Well, I can tell you that there's a bill called the American Family Act in the Senate and the House, and the Senate has, I believe, 37 sponsors now, and in the House it has 181 sponsors. And it does everything that I just described, $250 child allowance paid monthly. When it was introduced, it had 2 sponsors. We were like, yay, it got introduced. There's like 2 people. But now we're up to 37 in the Senate and 181 in the House. And to me, that gets into territory of something that really could be a reality. So I think the technical response to the reviewer on my case file who said that is, suck it. Sorry. You get to say things like that when they give you tenure, and you can just say whatever you want. I'm very convinced that we're not going to do something transformational if we don't try. So take a look at the child allowance, see what you think. Maybe you disagree with me, but let's talk about bold things and move them from pipe dream to reality. Thank you.
So I'm going to pose a few questions to the panel, and then we'll have time for Q&A. One I just wanted to mention, take a minute to mention, because I know we didn't get a chance to kind of, so the study's 600 pages, right? There's a lot in there. So just to let you know, some of the things in there to look for that we didn't get a chance to mention is that, the study has a pretty decent discussion around the importance of Medicaid, even though it doesn't model, right, the poverty reducing effects. We know that Medicaid reduces child poverty and has important. So, but it talks about the importance of Medicaid, even if it doesn't actually, model it for exactly how much, right, changes to Medicaid would reduce child poverty. It also talks about other, things in there that that they didn't model but are important, such as paid family leave. They discussed TANF a bit, right, and some of the challenges to modeling changes of that to child poverty reduction. There's also a lot of data in there about how a lot of these policies would affect different subgroups, right? So how we reduce racial and ethnic disparities, the impact particularly in reducing poverty among Black children, Hispanic children, non-citizen children, children in single-parent households. So there's a lot of data in there to look at, and they really do a great job of making sure to prioritize reducing disparities as part of it. So take a look at that section as well. And finally, there's a big part around neighborhoods of persistent poverty, and the kind of contextual factors in reducing persistent poverty versus in places where it's kind of more just current in time. So again, that also might be helpful. So a lot in there. But okay, so I want to pose a question to our Christine and Luke. So, what are some of the barriers that you see, kind of in implementing some of these of what we see in the study? And in particular, right, as one of the children's advocates kind of on this panel, what are the particular barriers for children, right? When we're doing child advocacy, what are some of the particular barriers we see around really improving outcomes for children in particular?
Well, I think, most of the barriers to doing everything that's in the report are political, and trying to, I think, come to a common agenda about what matters to us as a country and how we should live that out in our policy. I think a second piece of that is a question about cost, right? So that was another criticism when our original paper came out. And a criticism of the recommendations of the report is that this costs a lot of money. Interestingly, I think that conversation changed when we had the large tax cut, which is a fair amount more expensive, or at least equivalently expensive, is what we lay out with a child allowance, right? So as we talked about what is the good use of our resources, the conversation changed in that regard. We have always had a big tie to work, right, with our safety net. So I think work is a fundamental sort of value, is connected to fundamental values in society. And so I think the standard logic has always been policies that are not tied to work are politically less viable. And I think that sort of premise, right, has guided a lot of the way that we do policy making through huge expansions of the earned income tax credit that I love, but you only get if you're working. I think it's a misnomer to call it a safety net, per se. And reductions in the access to cash assistance, right, for families at the very bottom. And when we've done the tying of stuff to work, there have been some consequences to that I think we have to start to talk about. So when you look at the current child tax credit, 50% of Black and Hispanic children don't receive the full CTC. And 1 in 5 don't get anything at all of Black children. And 70% of children in single mother families don't get the full credit because it all phases in with earnings, right? So to me, I think this is a time to reassess our, this premise of tying everything that we do to work. And it's possible that I'm wrong and that a policy that isn't tied to work will go down in flames. But I do worry that sometimes in our discussions, we've taken that so much as a fact, right? It's almost like a religious fact. That we rule ourselves out from thinking about what really matters. And that's part of what I really admired about this report, is it asks the question of what do we really have to do to reduce child poverty in a transformational way, and came to the conclusion that we're not going to do it only with benefits that are tied to work. Not to say we shouldn't have benefits that are tied to work, but that can't be the only game in town.
So I'm going to give you two answers, because I'm going to have to take my Child Welfare League hat off and give you the answer through the lens of the National Academies. Some of the most, this work took place over 2 years, well, 2 years plus, and some of the most robust conversations were around work and marriage and what we could say. And they connect right back to this values perspective in this country that ties back to the extent to which we value our children and believe in and value their parents for wanting to do the same thing. And there's a very, very strange perception of what work is for lower income people. It's not recognized that work is usually tying together about 8 different things that you're doing in a day in order to knit together enough to even just, afford anything. And so the difficulty of work, the challenges of work are not elevated enough in conversations. So it was through that as the committee we were able to say, let's really look carefully at work. Let's look carefully at the extent to which people want to work and what's preventing them from working, and the extent to which work requirements impact the ability of people to access other services and benefits. So that's one of the things in the report that I think is important to look at. TANF is a really good example of this. Go this way. TANF is a really good example of where we had real challenges because there's no constituency around TANF. Temporary assistance for needy families, the perception is about those people who need money. And so now I'll put my child welfare hat on, and the families that we come into contact with are families that want to work for the most part, even though the perception of the child welfare world is that these are people different somehow from us. But it's people who want to work, people who want to raise their children, but who are dealing with all of the contextual issues that are mentioned in the report. So for me, really finding that balance between understanding when it's values perspectives that are holding us back versus when it's evidence. There's a huge lack of evidence in this country for any programs related to children and families, a huge lack. And one of the chapters in the report talks about the fact that there's not good evidence. There's not good, and why is that? Because it's not a good, it goes back to the values. Well, we can't help those folks with all the research in the world because they just want to be poor. Or they just want to do what they're doing right now. So focusing on evidence and making sure that evidence, we knew nothing about the Native American population. Very, very little about the Native American population because no one collects information. It's always, well, they're too small a population for us to understand. There's very limited information about Medicare or Medicaid or even housing, and its significance for people. So there's a whole chapter saying we have to value people enough that we want to do research about them. I mean, it's kind of simple. We haven't integrated information, so when we think about studying a community, it's usually, well, we're going to study this African American community and look at the impact of race on various things without understanding that those same people are also people who, in addition to race, there's age, there's income, there's so many other things that we need to look at and tease out to better understand what's happening. So with both my CWLA hat on and the committee hat, I think we have a real problem in this country in valuing people who have less than we have. And that's what we really need to address in order to move this forward and recognize that everyone deserves to be able to raise their children the way they want to raise them,
Yeah. And, I'll add to that, in advocating for children on the federal level, and this thing might be shared, it's really hard to get lawmakers to prioritize kids. They always say they care about kids, right? I believe many of them do. But, there's no constituency to hold them accountable for kids. Kids don't vote. There's no kids' political PACs, right? So, they can say and give lip service to doing something about kids, but then won't, actually always make them a priority. And that, for the public as well, and we've done polling as to what are the most important issues for you in an election. Kids never come up, right? But then when you asked, well, what about, they're like, well, of course, but they would never think that as a political issue, right? They would never vote based on what a lawmaker says they're going to do for kids. And so, we see in the media, it's often kind of still a soft issue, right? Something happening around kids. That, I think a study like this is really helpful and got some attention, but we need to really use it to really push forward as this has to be a priority. We always say kids are a quarter of our population, but all of our future, right? Sometimes that that helps a little bit, but I think building on all the things we just discussed is, in particular, doing something around kids we find really difficult. So, we want to leave plenty of time for you guys to ask questions, and then if there isn't, a lot, we could always facilitate some more up here, but want to open it up to the audience for questions.
Hi, thank you. This has been really stimulating. My name is Dan Frayne. I'm a family physician in Asheville, North Carolina. And I'm wondering, a lot of what you talk about in this study is on the federal level. What is your recommendations if we have influence on the local level in our community, our city, our county, our region? What can we implement locally without waiting for the federal changes that you suggest? Is there any nuggets that we could take locally and have control over to influence this?
I would just, first of all, there's a tool that will help you understand your local dynamics that I think is important to look at this on the National Academies website. We did look at least drill down to the state level to understand better the implications of some of the changes on the states. And I think the biggest takeaway for the committee was how different states were from each other in terms of how they used various programs and services and how they did or did not provide fair access to programs and services. So I think it's important to do a comparison of your state to other states. Are there things that you're not doing that you could be doing, but you just didn't know you could? You could find that by looking at other states. And I think really understanding that the Earned Income Tax Credit Program, for example, can be done at the state level also as an addition. So there are things you can do at the state level, and many states are way behind other states in terms of the extent to which they've picked up these various benefits, and they need to understand that they are so you can be strong advocates to get your state to move forward.
I agree with all of that, and I guess I would just recommend a starting place would be to do some listening and try to connect with the communities and the folks who you are trying to work, whose behalf you would like to work on, and ask them what's going on with them, because sometimes the answers surprise us. So I've been, as I mentioned, doing a lot of work in the city of Detroit, and when I went in and formed this partnership with the mayor on economic mobility, trying to identify the policies that we could pursue to enhance economic mobility in the poorest large city in the country, I can tell you for certain that the one issue that was not on my mind was the cost of auto insurance. So Michigan has the highest auto insurance in the country, and Detroit has the highest auto insurance in Michigan. So the same policy that costs $1,300 nationally is $5,400 in the city of Detroit. And this is the outcome of actually well-intentioned policies. So in Michigan, years ago, we said, you know what, if you suffer major medical challenges after an auto accident, you shouldn't have to worry at all. You should be covered. And so we have this unlimited cap of medical expenses for folks who are injured in auto. And then also it turns out that things get a little more complicated when you look under the hood. Sorry for the pun. That if your auto insurance pays a medical bill, in Michigan, they pay 100% of whatever they're charged. Well, we know if your health insurance pays a medical bill, they only pay like 50 or 60%. And then finally, that companies are starting to use a lot of these non-driving factors to set the rates. So they say, in Michigan, if you have bad credit and a perfect driving record, you'll pay more in auto insurance than someone who has excellent credit in a DUI. So when we started asking around, working in surveys, going to community meetings, asking people what they needed to change, auto insurance bubbled up to the top, always. And so we've gotten involved in that debate, and that's a very sort of particular debate to the state of Michigan. But we released a brief a few weeks ago, and we're in the Free Press and the Detroit News, and actually we're here on behalf of Congresswoman Tlaib to testify in the House. And I think that was part of an effort in Michigan where we now have some bills that are working their way through the House and the Senate. And we're hoping that we're going to get real relief soon. So that's, one of those issues that I was saying, from the comfort of our offices, we often just don't even know the right questions to ask a lot of the time. In housing, a lot of the laws are local. So I think we have to figure out a way to drive down the cost of building housing in this country. Right now, it's just untenable what it costs to build affordable housing. But most of those costs are wrapped up in zoning laws. So could you look in your community at exclusionary zoning laws, right? Where when communities could no longer segregate, right, by race or income, they found other things to segregate by sort of making it impossible to build units that folks at the lower income, lower levels of the income distribution could afford. Low-income housing tax credit, how is that taken up in your communities? I think that's a place where there's lots of opportunity, but starting with listening, I think, is important because often the answers will surprise us.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add, there's some places where they formed things like they're calling child poverty councils, right? Or some kind of cross-sector group where folks from different agencies are coming together to at least connect and kind of examine, right? Again, why do we might have, particularly high child poverty rate, or what's causing it? And then they could take on particular issues that's affecting kids in their state. So, maybe it's increasing state, minimum wage. Maybe it's, creating a state EITC or child tax credit, whatever it is, but then you could, be communicating about that and working across those silos, and we've seen more progress in places. You could set a state child poverty target, as we've seen in some places, at least say we care about working towards this goal and we want to figure out, what we need to do around it, and increasing data for sure on kids. We know that, we need more data around what's affecting kids.
I just want to say how important the listening piece is, but you also have to really listen, right? So I was at a community session where the neighbors were asked what was their number one problem, and they said it was rats. And the group that was sponsoring it had nothing to do with rats and all. So they kind of dismissed that as well, it's just rats. So they lost so much credibility with that community by dismissing it in that way, that it would have been better for them not to even ask the question. So you have to ask it knowing you better.
There's such an opportunity lost there, right? Because if they take care of the rats, that community is going to be willing to listen to what they have to say a whole lot more in the next round.
Hi. Morning, everyone. Wonderful panel. Thank you. The information is great. My name is Harold Simon, and I'm from Shelter Force Magazine. We're a 44-year-old community development publication, and we've been writing about everything that you've spoken about for 4.5 decades almost, especially housing. I have a question about something that was said at the very top of this presentation, that the problem we have is political will. And you've each spoken more or less directly about that, but can you tell us a little bit about strategies that we can use that the folks here who probably know all of the information without the data by just being there that you've presented, strategies that we can use to change that political will, and strategies that the folks in this room can use with their people that they serve. And please feel free to take your institutional hats off.
So I think really taking seriously the issues of framing and what are the messages that really connect with people that they can understand. You know, obviously I'm making a pitch for simpler programs. I think if people can't understand a program, it's harder for them to get behind it. So maybe a child allowance is right or not. I'm pretty sure it is, but maybe it's not. But it has all of these benefits of being simple, being something that connects broader constituencies, right? Where we can eliminate the kind of poverty that Kathy and I wrote about in $2 a day and positively impact middle-class families. I think a second piece of it is looking for strange bedfellows. So in my view, if you're spending all of your conversations and everyone's nodding at every single thing you said, you probably aren't talking to exactly the right constellation of people. And in Michigan, one example that we've had recently in my own work a number of years ago, to take us in a little different bit of a direction, I got really concerned about access to oral health care being a primary unmet health care need, especially of children. Is a major reason why kids miss school, why adults miss work. 30% of Americans say they don't think they can go to the dentist because of cost. And I, again, was like, hey, I've got this great idea that no one's ever thought of, that we should have like a nurse practitioner of the dental field that can take some of the scope of dentists. Mostly the restorative scope, being able to do fillings, right, and simple extractions. And yet again, when I looked, worldwide, it turns out 50 other countries were already doing this for a long time. And New Zealand has one of these exact types of providers and has eradicated untreated tooth decay among children. Eradicated untreated tooth decay among children. And so a couple of years ago, I started really pitching that, promoting that in the state of Michigan, saying, hey, we should take a really close look at bringing what people often refer to as a dental therapist. And that made me very unpopular among dentists, it turns out. But a lot of social service, actually my first hate mail in my career was from dentists. Some of my best friends are dentists now, but they generally don't like the idea. But a guy who really liked the idea was a guy named Mike Shirkey, who's the Republican head of the state Senate, and is a guy who comes at issues very differently than me, but thinks that we can improve access to services and improve well-being by reducing regulation. And he championed the dental therapy bill, and we passed it in Michigan. We're like the 5th state to pass a dental therapist. And I think it's a great example of issues that can straddle the divide. So I'm all about a child allowance, but I also think we have to look for opportunities of common ground, sort of look out sometimes of the usual suspects of the things that we're used to always thinking about. Because I see dental therapy as both a way to get more aid to kids and a way to create meaningful job opportunities. Now, at the same time that Mike Shirkey was championing the dental therapy and I was cheering him on, he was also championing Medicaid work requirements in Michigan, which I happen to think is epically bad policy. And so that was, I had some students, who would say, how can you promote this guy's agenda when he does this other thing that you disagree with? And I said, I think that's what we really have to do. We have to look for the common ground across groups and people who think differently from us. In Detroit, one of the things I'm most proud of that we've been able to do, of converting renters into homeowners when their landlords don't pay the property taxes, because you have a lot of people who come in and buy up homes super cheap, they don't invest in them, and they just throw them away when they get foreclosed on and buy a bunch more. And we were able to create a program that converted those renters into homeowners. That was done by the city's Department of Housing, a group of lawyers who represent poor folks who are dealing with tax foreclosure called the United Community Housing Coalition, and Quicken Loans, which is one of the biggest mortgage producers and in the country and headquartered in downtown Detroit, and there's a lot of ambivalence about the relationship between vulnerable communities in Detroit and Quicken Loans. But this partnership and this thing that we've now put about 600 families through and really stabilized their housing in Detroit was only possible because UCHC and Quicken Loans came together, found some common ground, and did something that practically mattered.
So I agree with everything you said. I would add or go one level deeper on a couple of things. One is I think we need to do more of what you all are about in this room, both on the advocacy level and the service delivery level. We need to be working more in partnerships, because what I find when I go on the Hill is that we get pitted against each other. If you go and talk about the importance of housing, then you must not be for child welfare, or vice versa. So forming partnerships with others, learning a common language that we can all use together, I think is critically important. So, and the second thing is, I believe around finding the common, I think I now believe that, and it's very heartbreaking to me, I believe that most people want to think about themselves as kind of do-gooders and want to be thought about as do-gooders, but they really are looking to get something out of it. And where we've been successful in places when we can show people the win-win for them. So a quick example, when I lived in Philadelphia, I ran the United Way there, and we had someone from the UPS on our board. And we were trying to get the state of Pennsylvania to add the third shift to be eligible for reimbursement for childcare. And so we were just being listened to as, yeah, you know, until we were sitting at a board meeting and the head of the organization, UPS, happened to mention that he was having trouble getting employees for the third shift. And we were able to make that connection for him, and all of a sudden he became our biggest advocate. So I like to think that the guy was a good guy, because he was, you know, he was on the board, he gave, but he got motivated when he saw the win-win. So I think beyond looking for the common areas, we really need to figure out what the win-win is, because that's, I think human nature is that's what gets us motivated and ready to go, right? Yeah, so.
My name is Michael Mira from Tacoma, Washington. Thank you very much for your discussion. You have listed recommendations. You attributed a decrease in child poverty that would result from each of them. Are those reductions cumulative?
So, not really, not the way you would want, because it's almost impossible to tease it out in that way. But we were able to look and make specific connections to certain programs reducing. Now, I actually think, given that question, the reality is we would see even a greater reduction if those programs started to work in a synchronized way with each other. But we weren't able to do that. I wish we could have. Poverty reduced by 100%.
Yeah, I think the only thing where that was done was in the packages, when they would have both the child allowance and the EITC as a way of saying, we have these different values of family and work, and packaging those together. So in that case, they are.
Well, please join me in thanking our panel.